What is the attraction to QAnon, a 21st century rhetorical act grounded in centuries old rhetorical forms? And what is its strategies and outcomes? That is what we'll work to unpack here with Professor Colleen Kelley. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's Digital Programming. I'm Ben Spegg and I'm the Vice President at the JES and I am a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. And with me for this conversation is my JES colleague, Miss Olivia Wickline, who brought this programming idea to the JES team and studied under Dr. Kelley at Penn State Barron.
In this conversation, we'll explore QAnon, the 21st century rhetorical act grounded in centuries-old rhetorical forms. Dr. Kelley will review the derived vocabulary from the early American paranoid style of political discourse grounded in millenarianism and apocalypticism ideologies, as well as good versus evil demonizing narratives. How has its language been weaponized? How is it dehumanizing its enemies? What role did the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol play in the continued story of QAnon? What historical precedents for the discursive transformation of deep state fantasies into violence since the time of Aristotle help us understand today? And how have the digital delivery systems of today changed that? Those are some of the questions we'll seek answers for here. Now, a bit about our presenter before we get to her presentation. Dr. Colleen Kelley received her PhD in Rhetoric and Communication from the University of Oregon. She's a tenured associate professor of communication at Penn State Barron, my alma mater. Her teaching areas include rhetorical and communication theory, public address, political communication, intercultural communication, and gender issues in communication. Her research interests include political communication, particularly the influence of the religious right on American politics, peace in communication, and ethics in communication.
Now, folks, since this program is first airing live on the JES Facebook page, we're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comments section below. Now, if you're listening to or watching a later broadcast of this event, still send us your questions, your comments to keep this conversation going. And of course, for more information about upcoming JES programs and publications, please visit jeserie.org and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Dr. Colleen Kelley, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, Ben. And thanks to all of you who are tuned in, listening, and watching. Let me begin with just a quick reference to something that we've all experienced fairly recently. In a very real sense, what happened on that cold afternoon at the U.S. Capitol just over 4 months ago, included an attempt to make what we now know are called QAnon manifest or real in a way that just hadn't occurred to most of us, most Americans prior to then. So QAnon, as I know most of you are aware of, but let me just do a quick review here, is a far right wing, very loosely organized network and community of believers who embrace a range of just a varied range of unsubstantiated beliefs. These views center on basically the idea that there's a cabal of Satan worshiping pedophiles, as strange as that may sound to most of you. That is a core theme that runs through a lot of this ideology. It mainly consists of what folks who believe in these ideas see as elitist Democrats and their enablers who have long controlled the deep state government and have blocked and undermined Donald Trump at every turn. 3 years ago, just 3 years ago, Q's post initially appeared in fringe and unregulated digital media boards, 4chan initially, then it switched to 8chan and later to 8KUN or Kun. These are toxic cyber sites for hate speech and, according to some, breeding grounds for mass shooters. They quickly viraled to everyday platforms, including YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. Many of you are probably familiar with this. Many of these amplified the venomous messages that originally began in these recess spaces to millions of people through very targeted, sophisticated algorithms. This poster that identified as Q became known simply as Q, and the movement itself sometimes uses that as its short circuit name. Claimed to be a high-ranking government insider initially, with access to classified information. Over the last couple of years, that has vacillated, and as some of you may know from the documentary that is being streamed, I guess, on Netflix, There are all kinds of interesting scenarios, but the point being, whether Q is an individual or a gathering of several different folks, there's some very common core attributes that can be drawn from it. Q predicted that a war would soon culminate in what they are using the phrase "the storm." I'll talk about that again in a moment. At an appointed time when Donald Trump would finally unmask this evil deep state conspiracy, punish its members, and bring us all to see the light of day. QAnon first received attention from mainstream people, particularly the press, in the end of 2017 through the early months of 2018. Their conspiracy theories started to really pick up traction because they were broadcast and embraced by some of the far right folks like Sean Hannity, InfoWars, Alex Jones. Some of you may be familiar with him. The presence in mass of QAnon adherents, however, at a very broadly televised Trump rally in 2018 was really the launching platform that marked the conspiracy theories entry into the mainstream. So between March and June of last year, right in the midst of COVID, Q's activity nearly tripled on Facebook and nearly doubled on Instagram and Twitter. By that time, it had spread to, just FYI, Europe, the Netherlands, the Balkans. It maintains an especially strong following in Germany. I'll just give a little diverting statement here. This is fascinating because Q in Germany promotes the belief that Germany is no longer or never was really a sovereign republic. Just to give you an idea, a little bit deeper dive of what's being thought of here, but rather a corporation created by the Allies in 1945 after World War II, and expressed its hope that Trump will lead an army to restore the Reich. This is what's flowing through their Q platform rhetoric. Canadians have also embraced QAnon, as have many different nations, Latin American and European, many of whom are failed or illiberal democracies themselves. Now, in February of this year, just to kind of get a hold on what some of the numbers look like now, a poll by the American Enterprise Institute found that almost 30% of Republicans believe the central claim of QAnon, of the deep state conspiracy, and that Donald Trump particularly is fighting a group of child sex traffickers, and that, again, the far reach is not just Democrats, but anyone that could be tagged as liberal or in that circle. Now, although Russia was not involved in the origins of QAnon, we do have substantial evidence that there are Russian-backed social media accounts propagated early by occupied by and propelled by QAnon claims as early as December of 17. Russian government-funded state media such as Russian Times or Sputnik have been amplifying the words of QAnon since 2019. And it apparently was very active right prior to the election in 20, citing the election at the end of 20, citing the organization's QAnon as evidence that the United States is torn by internal strife. So they used it in kind of a twisted way, but it still became very much a presence through their infiltration of our social media. It's very hard to say how many people are really involved in QAnon because there's, as I mentioned earlier to Olivia and Ben, there's no official directory. We don't get to have our vaccine cards for QAnon, but we do know the number is clearly not small and quite likely in the millions even now. NBC News last year reported on an internal Facebook study that found thousands of QAnon pages and groups operating with millions of members between them. Twitter, and this just gives you a sense of what kind of numbers might be out there in a deeper dive. Twitter removed 70,000 QAnon affiliated accounts after the attack on the Capitol in January. YouTube videos explaining the tenets of QAnon have gotten millions of hits before they were taken down by YouTube last year. So this is a phenomenon. We just aren't quite sure how to grab hold of it. Now, about as of very recently, 20% of Americans believe in QAnon. If you look at the rough numbers, over 50% of Americans, according to a recent NPR poll, think that it's possible that our country is run by a group of elite pedophiles. That one took me a minute to wrap my head around. Who are the QAnon folks? As I did a little bit more in-depth research prior to applying what I know rhetorically about this group of individuals, they come from a lot of different interest areas. For some, QAnon is really a massive multiplayer online game because of the way it invites participants to congregate in kind of a digital co-created shared reality, much like a lot of the fantasy games many folks have enjoyed for decades. These fantasies are filled with recurring characters, as you might expect, all enacting the deep state fantasies that exist. They involve quests and stories to be solved, et cetera, et cetera. One researcher just recently argued that it is as addictive as a video game, and offers players the appealing possibility of getting involved in something that is otherworldly, but also has historical significance. One Australian psychologist has emphasized the self-sealing quality of Kay's kaleidoscopic conspiracy theory. It's everything to everyone, and highlights that it's anonymous, which is a point I want to reiterate a couple of times. It is, Q's posts are difficult, if not impossible, to track down, and no one admits to them. So there's a use of plausible deniability, and this kind of twists, according to the psychologist, into evidence that makes the conspiracy valid in some people's minds. It's kind of a twisted kind of thinking. Part of this game-like quality is basically solving riddles, and one researcher has described Q as an innovator among conspiracy theorists that just has not been paralleled. He enthralls readers with cues and clues, and the audience is clearly being appealed to not through narratives or what it wants to write, but what it can do when it interacts with the material. So it's very much a rhetorically invitational activity. For many, Q may best be understood, and Olivia alluded to this in the introduction, as an example of what one author has identified as a paranoid style in American politics. And clearly QAnon's vocabulary echoes Christian tropes. That's obvious maybe to many of us already, such as the storm, which I've already mentioned, the Genesis flood judgment day narrative, the Great Awakening, which has permeated Western discourse, American discourse since the 18th century. According to one Q video, the battle between Trump and the cabal is nothing less than a fight of biblical proportions for the earth to for them to fight evil, and it produces kind of a sense of a reckoning through a reverse rapture. Not only will the end of the world as we know it happen, but there'll be a new beginning through salvation and a utopia on earth for those who are not members of this evil deep state nation. Others argue that QAnon is best understood as what they call American Gnosticism, white evangelism that is kind of morphed into Christian nationalism. And Trump's presidency has also been co-opted for that, sort of as a counter to the evil that's working to annihilate white American Christians. In this case, liberalism becomes synonymous with multiculturalism and all that comes with it. And then you make the connections from there to collective powers of the liberal press or mainstream press, established media, all forms of institutions, all expertise. And you can see where the connections go from here. So in this upside down world, at least in my view, it is those who have been indoctrinated by the national media and science who are living in ignorance. Only the people who've cultivated the kind of instinctual gut level truth that Q asks them to share in can piece together the clues that reveal the nefarious, deep, dark disinformation campaign that's out there trying to undermine Christian nation. Others argue that Q's rhetorical behavior is more specifically aligned with cults. And I know this is kind of a default that a lot of people fall into, but in this view, Q's devices mirror those of cults in the pre-digital era, where they kind of hook people and grab them in deeper and deeper so that they have little connection to the real world, but in a digital universe, they have thousands. So you can see, if any of you have done a deep dive into cult behavior, that is quite clearly a possibility. QAnon, interestingly, started in the mostly masculine resources of the dark corners of the web. Not to say that women were not in those corners, but it sort of, in one person's opinion, jumped the shark when it moved into more mainstream platforms like Facebook, Instagram, even Etsy. And they started to see more women and women's activities. And women started to become more mainstream, albeit digitally. Since then, its conspiracy theories have evolved from far-right forums into almost every version of social media that's out there. Women, particularly white suburban women, jump to platforms like YouTube and Instagram, and are key members in spreading the ideology. A quick illustration, Pastel QAnon is a collection of techniques to recruit women into conspiracy theory, mainly relying on social media sites, traditional ones, WhatsApp, TikTok, and Facebook. It uses stereotypically feminine coded aesthetics, including a pastel color palette, no less, language and communities as gateways to grab through their messaging some of these women that would otherwise not even look twice at some of the more darker delivery systems. FYI, two of those who died on January 6th were both women, and they were both QAnon followers. Now, some, especially middle-class or wealthy women, would never be drawn, at least openly, into a conspiracy. But there's an interesting little rhetorical tweak that seems to have been pretty effective. It draws these women into Q because it's all about saving children from them. A case in point, when Q began to appear on Instagram, it became more about literally saving the children, of course, from sex trafficking and cannibalism. That the calls were basically save the children, don't worry too much about it, but save the children, bolstered by laser-focused, rhetorically powerful, if not unethical appeals to the traditional stereotypes for a lot of women as caregivers and providers. Very powerful images. So by 2020, I found this fascinating. Some followers began using the Twitter hashtag literally save the children. Some of you may be familiar with that, and co-opted the trademark name of the child welfare legitimate organization into a kind of twisted save the children QAnon post, so that a lot of otherwise well-intentioned women, in many cases, were drawn into the platform and then get a deeper dive into some of its more darker arguments. Let me talk for just a minute about what's happened recently from late 2019 onwards and all the way through to the insurrection. By May of 19, the FBI identified QAnon-driven extremists as domestic terrorist threats. And I won't go into more detail here, except to say that the FBI has assessed their conspiracy theories as very likely to emerge, spread, and evolve in the modern information marketplace, and be driven by, in some cases, extremists who will ultimately be encouraged to likely carry out criminal or violent acts. That's where the FBI started coming in, and they've really taken a firmer stand in the last year. The Business Insider reported in July of 2020 that Trump's campaign was essentially wed, albeit not openly, but to the information that was coming from and to QAnon-related accounts. Hundreds of thousands of tweets were sent between early April and May, and another of the most popular words used in over 1,000 of the Twitter accounts at the time used QAnon as their key word. By 2020, Twitter had banned over 25,000 QAnon affiliated accounts, and this continues to this day. By July of last year, there were multiple attacks from multiple social media platforms against any kind of a digital delivery system that would give this information out. The Washington Post reported that at the beginning of 2020, advertisements for Trump's campaign had shown messages and images with prominent QAnon merchandise, which in turn was flipped over on the Q posts as signs of victory. So they were even co-opting what were just visuals at Trump rallies and using them as reinforcement to get more people to buy into their ideas. Facebook acted later in August of 2020, right before the election, to literally remove and restrict QAnon activity. And by then, even as I mentioned earlier, the digital platform Etsy, that really surprised me. I guess there was a huge calling for a lot of Q paraphernalia and images and I don't know, patterns that you could, macrame. And they were all taken off of QAnon site or Alpha Etsy site by then. So let me jump to the part of QAnon that really relates to my expertise as a rhetorical theorist and critic. There are distinct and rhetorically significant language strategies at play here. Q's messaging typically includes garden variety nonsense, but foundationed in historical and ongoing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. This is serious stuff. In August of last year, before the Democratic Convention, Q posted an image of the Democratic National Convention logo and argued that it resembled a satanic pentagram, and went on to provide script that said that Republicans discussed God at their party, while Democrats discussed darkness. And for those of us who aren't adherents, that may seem a little bit of a fragile argument, but such dialogue rises beyond the level of us versus them, at least in my view. The process of using the language of evil is not new. Particularly, I think telling, if you'll bear with me a minute, I'll do another little bit of a deep dive. An anti-Semitic canard published in 1903, some of you may be familiar with it, was called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It actually intersects and was intentionally merged with QAnon's conspiracy theories. A quick extension of this, there was a Republican QAnon supporter named Mary Ann Mendoza, very popular on most of the sites. She retweeted a Twitter thread about the Rothschild family, satanic high priestesses, and American presidents, saying, quote, "The protocols of the elders of Zion is not a fabrication, it is real." Now, this woman at the time was on the advisory board of Women for Trump and was scheduled to be a keynote address speaker at the Republican convention. I guess some calmer minds got wind of her proclivities and she was disinvited. But it is important to know that although Donald Trump has denied knowledge of QAnon, he's constantly said over and over that what he knows about QAnon is this, that he has fans, they like him, and they love our country. So you can read into that as you will. Now, examining how past rhetoric targets Jews specifically reveals how this discourse lubricates the machinery of violence. Hitler called the protocols, which I just referenced a minute ago, immensely instructive. Indeed, genocide scholar Gregory Stanton, way above my pay grade here, warned in an article in this September, that, I quote, "QAnon's demonic fantasy is a Nazi group rebranded," which itself absorbed a rebranded version of the protocols. So he makes a direct connection. In addition, much of QAnon's symbolic reality, in my language, words of use, is recycled conspiracy theories rooted in traditional anti-Semitic tropes that date back centuries. Jewish communities faced blood libel arguments and visions hundreds and hundreds of years ago that Jews kidnapped children for blood sacrifice. And for centuries before, the imagery again resurfaced in those protocols in the early 1900s. In the Middle Ages, this fear was driven by a fear of magicians kidnapping children. By 2020, QAnon's followers were advancing the notion, and some of you may have seen it in the far reaches of some of the media, Hollywood elites were engaging in adrenochrome harvesting, which was taking adrenaline to make, which is extracted from children's blood to get a real pure kind of psychoactive drug. A 21st century rebooting of anti-Semitic blood feud libel. Okay. So what's unique about this QAnon business, if it is simply using words that are centuries old, and what's new about that? At this point in time, what is different is that Q is fundamentally a digitally based, hyper-connected coalition that rhetorically operates in a different way, at a different scale than much of what those of us who have studied rhetorically or otherwise conspiracy theories have ever seen before. To illustrate, as I tried to show you briefly a few moments ago, it is highly and deeply participative in a way that few other popular conspiracy theories have ever been. You get together, you decode, you play the game to get there, you bond with fellow travelers and believers. In addition, there is an organic danger of what QAnon believes to be true, exploding, at least in my view, in this time and space compressed, anonymously sourced digital verse. I find that very troublesome. It's one thing to have such polarized and warped opinions mediated and countered in the marketplace of ideas and deconstructed through discourse and in heated but nonetheless vetted idea exchange. It's another to have millions of people lost in cyberspace, some of whom who are literally worried and terrified about the kidnapping, cannibalizing of innocent children. Now, you combine these violent paranoid fantasies with the fact that QAnon followers have been charged with serious crimes. It's an old principle in American social science that when people define situations as real, they become real in consequences. As a case in point, more than a dozen 2020 US House and Senate candidates ran on platforms which involved openly embracing at least some, if not all, of QAnon's conspiracy theories. As most of you already know, at least two of these candidates, Georgia's Marjorie Taylor Greene and Colorado's Lauren Boebert, won their races and are now sitting members of the US House of Representatives. Now, while these victories are the first and maybe the only Republican candidates who have successfully been backed by and referenced and grounded themselves in some of these deep state allegations of Q, Greene and Boebert represent a party in which the majority, I repeat again, well over 50 million, still believe that Q conspiracy fueled notion that Donald Trump had the election stolen from him and that he is still the de facto president of the United States. I'm going to wrap up by spending a bit of the last portion of my talk sharing with you some of the ideas of an author named Joshua Gunn, who just this year published a book called Political Perversion, Rhetorical. Hold on a minute. I'm okay. No, sorry. Can you see that on your screen? I just want to be sure.
We can't, Dr. Kelley, but I can enable screen share so that you can do that. Just give me 1 second for that. We appreciate that.
Thank you. I just got a message that my computer is rebooting. I thought I addressed that.
Okay, you were a co-host, so if you want to share something from your screen, please do.
Okay. No, that's fine. Am I being heard still?
Yes, Dr. Kelley, you're great. We've got you.
Let me just explain what just happened. I just had a message that I thought I had addressed earlier. This is part of my love with the digital, love-hate digital relationship. And my computer is designed to reboot, as all of them are. And it was supposed to reboot about 2 hours ago, but I set it for in the future. And I just got a message that said my computer's about to restart, and it panicked me. But it's about to restart in 3 hours. So I've got plenty of time.
And I apologize. I thought you were trying to share something. That's my fault. But we're just
No,
glad you're still with us and everything's going
no,
along. So let's jump back.
no.
And you were telling us about a book by James
Yeah,
Gunn.
sure. As somebody who's been Zooming classes to her students for almost 18 months, bear with me. I will recover. Okay, this book that was written in 2020, it just came out. It's called Political Perversion, Rhetorical Aberration in the Time of Trumpeteering. It's a mouthful, but it's got some really interesting points, I think, that are very relevant to this discussion. He particularly focuses on digital mass mediated rhetoric and points out, as I concur, that traditionally the field of rhetoric, my discipline, is focused on analyzing the conditions of and cultivating the skills required for persuasive oratory, establishing credibility. Olivia would know about this, having experienced some of my classes in person where I actually teach this. We focus on language as being suitable and adapted to a certain audience. You frame an argument as a narrative so that it can elicit ethically a response and the urge to take an action from your audience. So now, in the last 50 years or so, rhetoric encompasses essentially every form of communication, certainly digital and online platforms and what they contain, their content as well. So the stock of theories has changed substantially. However, the concepts and categories, and this is where I really connect with it, originally pertinent to, for example, giving a speech before an ancient jury, remain salient in the 21st century. One quick example, most of us are familiar with the former president's rhetorical moves during the last 4 years. One of them, I won't burden you with the official name, but it's a classic rhetorical trope where you introduce a topic by announcing you will not talk about it. And most of us probably can remember several examples, but the one that comes to mind for me was after a debate in which the Fox News moderator questioned the candidate about his misogynistic sensibilities. And Mr. Trump tweeted, "I refuse to call Megyn Kelly a bimbo because that would not be politically correct. Instead, I will call her only a lightweight reporter." So even something as, and those tropes, those kinds of language positionings have been around for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, Trump's career and legacy has too often been understood as, or dismissed as, just successful application of like the art of the grift, to him being just in a larger apprentice universe. Gunn returns to the core question of how effective rhetoric is contingent on the triadic relationship between speaker, audience, and occasion. And I find that as a rhetorical theorist and as a person who's talking to you this afternoon about QAnon, really an important point. For example, both in style and content, Donald Trump's rhetoric was and continues to be congruent with, first, the weakening or effective disappearance of widely accepted legitimate forms of political authority, okay? And secondly, his need for speed, now, fast, get it out there. The tendency of transportation, economic transactions, and communication to accelerate. I think that was one of the reasons, frankly, he was so fond of, and still would be had he had a platform still for tweets. Now, to be clear, QAnon is not the result of Trump's brainstorms. That's nothing that I would ever argue. From this perspective, he has essentially nothing to do with the phenomenon, except Q has become a twisted form of Trump fan fiction. It's a way for his base to sustain often horrific, sometimes silly, but occasionally deadly, always groundless, but significantly emotionally intense connections with him while in the Q universe. To borrow Gunn's words, what happens here is it allows those who jump on these Q platforms the joy of imagining scenes worthy of the Marquis de Sade and enjoying the pleasures of violent indignation at the same time. So in conclusion, Gunn argues that QAnon is the newest iteration of a centuries-old blood fantasy libel. We know that, but it's different. And it's different because the media infrastructure and the speed of communication, which makes space and time reflection far more difficult, if not impossible. I'll share one final quote from him. According to Gunn, wired and Wi-Fi life now is geared toward reaction and stimulation, hypercognition, not deep thought or deliberation. Click and read this, react to this video, film yourself reacting to it, follow the link and see where what rabbit hole it goes down, and so on and so on. The images become almost phatic to the core. So in short, back to Dr. Kelley's view here, I believe what we learn from the study of words and actions, beginning with rhetorical theories introduced by the Greeks more than 25 centuries ago, to the contemporary and social science examinations, which we are privy to and able to dive into today, words and rhetoric, which symbolically dehumanize the other, are gateways to mass violence. This is nothing new. The two are historically, inextricably, undeniably connected. And what we know is that QAnon both dehumanizes and demonizes. So this, combined with the mystical kind of quasi-religious quality that so many of Q's followers embrace, is worrisome. We are therefore, I believe, unwise to cavalierly respond to Q as merely wacky or false. The malevolent content of such tropes and visions has been used in similar context as weaponized rhetoric. But in this century, the time and space and rapid delivery and the ability to reach millions of individuals with such toxic ideas and millions who are particularly susceptible because of the algorithmic targeting that goes on is troublesome in so many ways, because it allows Q's sensationalized, unsettling, laser focused content to reach those most likely to embrace its toxic ideas. Now, maybe if there's time, we can talk about how what can be done or is going on to counter these tropes and this digitalized platform. But what I'd like to end with, at least for my portion, is despite how deep state, how treacherous this deep state narrative may be, I argue that what makes QAnon truly dangerous is its demonizing rhetoric. Because from my perspective, words matter, bottom line. I say this because Q's rhetoric bears an uncomfortable resemblance to the kind of vitriolic propaganda that has been used not only for centuries, but even recently to promote genocide. I ran across a study by a scholar named Paul Brass, who's analyzed the demonization of Muslims as terrorist aggressors by the Hindu Nationalist Party recently. And that became a critical part of what enabled the Indian People's Party to conduct deadly attacks in 2002 on Muslims, with over 1,000 people killed, 2,000 injured. Continuing on, Human Rights Watch has cataloged the way in which Rwanda's genocide, which many of you are as tragically aware of it, I think, as I am, which took place in '94. It took the lives of 900,000 Tutsis in less than 8 months. And it was propelled by frequent nationalist radio, Hutu broadcasts stating that the Tutsis were cockroaches and vile, and the country could only be cured if the pestilence was eliminated. In the 90s, Serbia, Milosevic used government broadcasts of false stories of Croatians literally slaughtering children and other such atrocities, which helped fuel the massacre of over 8,000 Bosnian Muslims. More recently, a Buddhist monk who is the leader of a decentralized Buddhist national monument has promoted the genocide and killings of Myanmar's Muslim minority by asserting in widely broadcast sermons that the Rohingya are reincarnated snakes and insects who could justifiably be killed. The results? 6,000 dead, 600,000 displaced. Now, as I conclude here, I'm not trying to make a direct connection between Q followers or any of us who who have jumped on and off some of these conspiracy theory sites that are passing on Q's ideologies. To conclude with, those in my discipline know certain truths, if I can kind of be poetic about it. From the study of the symbiotic relationship between words and actions, what do we know? We know that words, language and use, rhetoric, which systematically dehumanizes others, is essentially a gateway to violence. We know these two are historically, undeniably, inextricably connected. We know that QAnon does both, and that such information, when combined with a quasi-religious quality, is troublesome. And we know that it's unwise to casually make light of QAnon. It's not silly. It's not just flat out wrong. We also know that such speech acts are almost certainly symptoms of something deeper. We know such malevolent tropes and visions have historically appeared in similar contexts centuries back as weaponized discourse. And finally, we know Q's 21st century digital time and space compressed, anonymously created, and cyber launched rhetorical missives have successfully targeted millions of particularly vulnerable people. In short, Q's rhetoric demands, in my view, some vigilant attention, deconstruction, and a vigorous rhetorical response. Despite generally occurring outside the comfort zone or line of vision of most of us, history has shown that this kind of acivil, uncivilizing, anti-democratic discourse thrives in the dark, literally and metaphorically. I repeat, words matter. They have always mattered. They will continue to matter. So that Q's rhetorical world resembles the propagandic universes that have repeatedly promoted group, ethnic, and genocidal conflicts for centuries is not new. But what is important and different here is that their convoluted, hysterical, but lethal visions, because they are digitally launched, have weaponized our interconnectedness with unprecedented agency. Let me repeat that again. The fact that this is occurring in a digital platform delivery system that weaponizes the interconnectedness of millions and millions with unprecedented agency and urgency. So my final parting statement would be that I believe this has occurred to such an extent that how we understand and rhetorically respond to this phenomenon and others like it will be instrumental in determining not only the health, but the well-being and trajectory of American constitutional democracy in this century and probably beyond. I'm done. Thank you.
Dr. Colleen Kelley, thank you. And we're not done with you. We've got audience questions. We've got some of our own. There's a lot to unpack there. And I think you mentioned, wanting to take a look at perhaps some of those next steps. And so I'm going to turn over to Olivia to pitch the first question. I'm going to take a look into the comment section, the Facebook post. I'm going to look for some audience questions. I'll be back in a second. Once I've gotten those. Folks, friendly reminder, we are taking those questions as comments in that comment section. Olivia, over to you for the first question.
Yes, so you spoke a lot about the techniques that are used, the rhetorical techniques that are used to get people involved in QAnon. Is there any way to interrupt this sort of radicalization process for those starting their entrance or maybe dipping their toes into what is being shared?
Sure, I can say specifically there's two efforts that I ran across. One is Reddit actually has some deprogramming access sites that are intentionally targeting both people who are Q members and maybe would like to leave or like to find a counter view, and families of Q members so that they can start having a counter narrative to share into, so that they're not being told, this is wrong or stupid or silly, but they are being given counter perspectives to think about as they consume these other views. And then the other efforts, there are also some self-help sites on social media that have gone up that are targeting not specifically just Q, but any people who feel that they have been immersed in too much of a single view, that they are feeling uncomfortable. That could be any kind of an extremist ideology that they need to take a break from, or don't know, maybe in an addicted sense, how to break out of. So that's two of the examples that I found. The other quick response to your question, Olivia, is historically, when there have, this kind of discourse has been around for centuries, and we know by following the propaganda, the horror stories that Goebbels, who was Hitler's propaganda minister during the World War II, counter stories. I keep saying, let's counter it with our rhetoric. Start chatting and present counter visions of these great fantasies out there, but make them truth-based, reality-based, make them exciting and sensational and colorful, maybe pastels, but give the counter stories so that most of the folks that are involved in these are thinking, cognitively healthy adults. And they're just looking they need more information.
And Dr. Kelley, I think that picks up right where one of our audience questions, they're curious about that too. And this person's noting that, while other attraction to cults, there seems to be some element of truth at times. There's no truth here, this person is saying, and asking broadly, and I think you've gone through this so well, what is the appeal? Why do people get hooked on this and then hooked into it? And this person notes some of the things you said throughout the presentation. These are not, this person uses the words less sophisticated or dim-witted. There are intelligent people drawn to this conspiracy theory, and asking what can be done other than removing people from platforms or removing platforms entirely. And I think I would take that, because I think you answered a lot of that just now. I take that a step further and say, what about regulating these platforms? Should we have a regulatory body akin to the FCC to be able to step in and do this? Can we count on the platforms to self-regulate and to look at this content and remove users and remove posts? Or should we have some authority that's a watchdog that's monitoring this, akin to the FCC?
Yeah, a lot to think about there. I can address the FCC issue. That's, again, my favorite default for the afternoon. That's out of my pay grade. That's not my pay grade, but I can tell you, I believe inevitably the internet is going to be subject to content and carry laws and rules and restrictions, as all of our mass media, at least in the United States, and will be accountable. Right now, I can't remember the law, but right now platforms are not responsible for the content that they launch. I think that's going to change fairly soon. And then the other issue is, no, I think one of the things we know about conspiracy theories and some of these that people tend to dismiss as crackpot, there are good reasons for almost all of us, majority of whom are quite sane, for believing and behaving in ways that to others just don't seem reasonable. I mean, just look at friends and family that you have, and I don't mean just politically, but they embrace and you go, how could you possibly? And they go, how can you possibly not? So I think to unpack it as not something that is wrong for you to believe, but to unpack it as if this is wrong information that you've been presented with. Does that make sense?
That absolutely does, Dr. Kelley. And I'm going to sneak in one more audience question and encourage folks to leave more. And then I'll pitch back over to Olivia with some questions. This person, I think, might be thinking like I was. I was recalling a colleague at the JES has a map from the Southern Poverty Law Center of the rise of hate groups and mapping those out. This person's wondering, geographically, do we know the concentration of QAnon followers? Would we be able to find out that number? How many are in a place like Erie County where we are? Are we able to track that? Do we know that? How might we explore that in our own backyard?
From my understanding, that would be a tough sell right now because it's a digital platform. And it's a platform that is global as well. And I cannot, I think that originally you could probably, back in 17 or 18, the majority of Q's followers were followers of Mr. Trump, his base. And if you could geographically locate that, you might have been able to do that then. But I think conspiracy theories appeal to people, particularly in times of feeling unsettled. So that's why it's really grown during the pandemic. So I don't think that line of inquiry would be very useful. I don't think you can corral them like that.
I appreciate that answer. I'm going to pitch back over to Olivia. I'm going to take another look in the comment section. I know we're almost out of time, folks. We appreciate you sticking through for this program, asking your questions. And of course, if you're watching or listening to a later broadcast, we still welcome that. Keep the conversation going, keep engaged around this topic. Olivia, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So you spoke about how different platforms were purging themselves of different accounts associated with QAnon. Is there a particular social platform that attracts more QAnon attention than other platforms, or have you seen growth of new platforms, particularly for the QAnon community?
My understanding is that the platforms that appeal to this kind of messaging are unregulated, and that's why 4chan, 8chan, and the like. And I do believe that Q may have gone silent shortly after January. I'm not sure. I don't follow the platforms, but I think regulation is the major issue. They don't want to have anyone in any way, shape, or form curtailing what they want to post. Yeah, that would be my response.
So, Dr. Kelley, one more question, and I think this goes back to what do we do about this on these platforms and the regulatory action against it? Somebody from the comment sections bringing up what we hear often too: First Amendment rights. I have my First Amendment rights to say whatever I want, or I don't have the rights to say whatever I want. Where do we look to the First Amendment in context of what we're seeing from QAnon followers, QAnon posts? How are you following that when it comes to how words matter, how we use them mattering in light of our First Amendment rights?
Ironically, I didn't work it into my talk, but I ran across an article that actually addressed that for a constitutional scholar. And at least their position was that the founders of the country would be absolutely scratching their heads over how we are interpreting our First Amendment today. And I'll just synopsize it to say that the general intent of the First Amendment was never irresponsible speech. It never was. And it was also speech that was supposed to primarily be used to keep the power base of our federal government from overriding the people, which was the heritage. So the rules and regulations for the First Amendment are not meant to protect American speech no matter what. That was never the intent. And even the Supreme Court and federal courts ruling on speech don't represent that. So it's responsible speech. And I think in my final statement on that is, even when I teach my basic courses, I always teach that it's your right to speak in a public forum with very few restrictions, but it never was your right to speak irresponsibly. You have to own what you say. So that's where, back to Olivia's question, that idea of what kind of platforms do Q people want to live on? They want to live somewhere where nobody's going to be there, like me, saying you have to go ahead and post it, but you own what you post.
And one more audience question I'm going to sneak in too is again looking at words mattering. This person, very lengthy post, and there's a lot to unpack there. But what I take away at the top of it is just the use of the word cult. When you enter a conversation using the word cult, that can be a deterrent for those on the other side being called participants of a cult because of the connection and association we have with that word. How do we get around those conversations? How do we get that started? And I think that might, Dr. Kelley, come back to one of the things you were mentioning before of talking to our friends and family of how can you believe this? And the rhetorical answer is, well, how can you not believe this? And then we end up in a back and forth of just talking at each other rather than with each other. So when we're using language like the word cult, how do we work through that?
Let me say that I maybe I didn't frame it correctly. Cult was just one small segment of the idea that some of the ideology has very much a organizational components and a belief system that is mirrored in several different kinds of religious ideologies. So that wasn't meant to be a slam. That was meant to be the cult. A cult is not a religion necessarily. A cult is an ideology that is grounded in panic and a sense of loss and belonging. In my understanding, religions, whether they're world or personal, are not that at all. So I didn't mean that to be my, I don't personally consider Q a cult at all, but I think that's problematic. And whoever asked that question is spot on. That would be a conversation closer for many people.
So I'm going to pitch back over to Olivia. I think that is the important words matter. We've got a couple of questions before we head out. I know Olivia's looking at two of those. I'm going to keep an eye on the comment section. Olivia, back over to you.
Absolutely. So one of the main thoughts with this, and you talked about Q going silent after that January 6th riot. Have you seen, has there been any kind of proliferation or decline in the public interest of QAnon following the January 6th riot and in the recent months and weeks?
I can't give you, I don't have numbers at my, I can't speak right now. Right after the insurrection, because paraphernalia was so present, there was a lot of chatter even on mainstream news. I think its popularity has not dimmed for the people who follow it. I don't know how to address whether or not it's being followed in mainstream media, possibly because so many more horrible things have pushed it off the radar in the last month. So the followers are there. They are waiting after Mr. Biden won the presidency. There was a drop off, and then Q stepped up again and jumped right into picking up the mantle that, well, he's not a president by the cabal, but he's our president, and that has gained life. What we're waiting to see now is what appears as Q. And I even last couple of weeks, I haven't seen any active posts that are attributed to Q. Q could be individuals or a group of people or one person. But the chatter and the places to chatter are still there. Sorry, I couldn't give you a more contained answer.
No, that's great. And I mean, we've covered so much within this past hour. I'm excited to go back and just re-listen to everything that we went through, really. But to exit out of this, what is one thing, out of everything that we've spoken about, for the people watching and listening here to take away and think about, to maybe, I don't know, wake up tomorrow and be thinking about this? What is one takeaway? What would you hope that it would be?
I think it would be pretty simple. Let's just focus on owning our thoughts that come out as words. And that's not meant to be like this. I think all of us, we don't have much time in this day and age to just be quiet with ourselves. And I think a lot of people just don't have time to be quiet. And that's why some of these ideas can get jumbled up in our heads. So own your own thoughts. And when others have them, understand that maybe they need to own their own, and then find a space we need some room to do something to converse about those different thoughts.
I like that, own your own thoughts, because I can't help but think the digital accessibility these days, the ease in which we can copy and paste and go from one post to another post and to another post and another post. And we see that with automated bots, but we also see it with humans. And so I love that. Own your own thoughts. And I also love that words matter. And there's so much more that I've loved about this conversation that, like Olivia said, we did not get a chance to get to. So I can't wait to have you back. Dr. Colleen Kelley. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely, sharing your knowledge, your expertise, taking a look at the rhetoric behind conspiracy theories and QAnon. So much more to unpack. You took the time, energy, and effort to share that with us in conversation. We're so grateful for that. Plenty of conversation still happening in the comments section. Folks posting resources, folks posting ideas and sharing back and forth. So clearly, people want to talk about this. We can't wait to have you back. And all of you posting in the comment section, watching along at home, whether you're tuned in real time to the JES Facebook page or watching or listening to a later broadcast, streaming it on demand. We are grateful for you tuning in. Without you, these programs cannot happen. And of course, a big friendly reminder to stream other JES digital programs on demand. Head over to our website, jeserie.org. There, you're also going to find details about upcoming programs, plenty on the radar for that, as well as a wide range of publications from quick, timely reads to reports to essays and more, all free, available to download. And of course, be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, on behalf of my colleague, Miss Olivia Wickline, I'm Ben Spegan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.
Thank you.